Welcome back to episode 3 of the long and exhausting binge. Today's video is a big one. I'm gonna be ranking the MCU's 11 Phase 3 movies ranging from Captain America Civil War to Spider-Man Far From Home. This, in my opinion, is where the MCU really starts to get interesting. I for sure had much more fun rewatching these movies than the ones from the previous phases. So without further ado, let's begin with number 11. For a sequel to a movie that was just alright, this movie is a much greater letdown. All of the stuff that I found interesting in the first movie, like Scott having to fight to be able to see his daughter more, or Scott having to deal with the legal repercussions of his past, are just kinda non-existent or just not much of a big deal in this film. Cassie's mom and her boyfriend do not have a grudge against Scott anymore, and despite being under house arrest, it didn't feel like Scott had any consequences for the events of Civil War. Like, the beginning of Ant-Man starts with Scott in prison, and then the beginning of this movie, he's just chilling at home singing songs. The humor, which for the first movie was the best part about it, is only good for certain scenes and then just kinda lame for other scenes, and I just wasn't as engaged with any of the action in this movie. I don't really have a problem with any of the plot, but overall I feel like it didn't contribute enough to justify watching the movie. Let's be honest, the only reason people even wanted to see this movie when it came out is because they wanted to see the post-credits scene. But with all that being said, I still think this is a good movie, which really goes to show how great Phase 3 as a whole is. The visuals in this movie are stunning, and the world building around the Mystic Arts was really interesting, but the story itself wasn't really good. Just like basically every other Marvel movie, the villain really sucked. And I'm not gonna lie, I forgot just how unlikable Stephen Strange is in this movie compared to the other MCU movies. It is so hard to sympathize with this dude after his car crash that he clearly caused by trying to pass someone at a high speed on the side of a mountain. In the rain. Like, bro, you don't even need Hugo Lord to figure this one out.
Lawyer's reaction.
Doctor Strange is obviously liable for everything. What a dumb. I also think it's kind of weird that they let Strange keep the Time Stone for so long. They clearly did not trust him with it, but they needed him to keep it for a while so that he can fix everything in the end. Overall, this movie is cool to look at, but only okay to watch. Oh boy, this is a movie that got a lot of really stupid criticism from people who thought that it was the end of the world to see a super tame, feminist-driven plotline in their precious Marvel film. The correct way to criticize the feminism in this movie is to show what they didn't do. It's clear they were shooting for Carol to feel oppressed by all the men in her life holding her back from her potential. Jan was the best example of it by literally holding her powers back from her, but it didn't really feel like all the 2-second flashback scenes that they showed did anything to complement that. Carol crashing while driving go-karts and then having her father yell, "You don't belong here," is not an example of misogyny. That's just a heartless father who doesn't care about his injured daughter. Every example they show of Carol being oppressed earlier in her life is not really an example of structural misogyny in the same way Jan holding her powers back from her is. But hey, who am I to define feminism and misogyny, am I right? I just feel like thematically the film would have been better if they showed scenes like Carol signing up for the go-kart race only for her to be denied entry because she's a woman or something. But I feel like I'm more forgiving towards this film because it's fun to watch, the story is engaging, the characters are interesting, and the stupid criticism for it has honestly made me want to like the movie more. So yeah, it's not a bad movie. You know, I think as a teen comedy, this is a great movie. It's funny to see all these cool characters go on a trip to Europe while Peter accidentally calls a drone strike on their bus while trying to win over MJ. It's also a nice change of pace to see something funny like this right after Endgame. But all the stuff surrounding Mysterio really gets me frustrated. He is by no means a good villain. The twist in the middle of the movie was so incredibly out of left field and relied way too much on bringing back characters that people forgot about years ago. And all for what? So he can control Tony Stark's technology and rule the world? This dude is basically just Syndrome, but without the good motivation and without the hair. He is missing Syndrome's fire hair. And honestly, because of this super dumb twist, Far From Home unfortunately ends up being the worst of the 3 MCU Spider-Man films. It's entertaining to watch, but you gotta make some major leaps in logic to be okay with Mysterio's existence as the villain in this movie. You know, one thing I've always wondered about with this movie is why are they just now deciding that the Avengers need to be a government entity? Like, what was so devastating about this one fight at the beginning of the movie that wasn't devastating in the other public battles they've had? Either way, I still like the conversations they had about publicizing the Avengers or not. And I think both sides of the argument have fair points. A majority of this movie feels pretty slow in comparison to other movies like this, like Winter Soldier or the previous Avengers movies, and I feel like that has made me less and less excited to rewatch this one specifically specifically. A large majority of the plot could have been easily resolved had there been a formal, genuine conversation between all these characters about what was going on, and that kind of frustrates me. But still, this is a really important MCU movie. I just wish they had focused more on the story than trying to cram every single character into it to make it seem like Avengers 2.5. Oh my god, Marvel finally did it. They got Thor right. They finally realized that they should take a step back from making him a whiny crybaby and focus on just how cool of a superhero he is. They were able to nail the comedy with him, which makes us actually care about Thor. I'm not rolling my eyes at him anymore. I'm laughing with him because he's not taking things so seriously anymore. The plot itself was okay. I liked what they did on Sakaar, but all the stuff that was happening with Hela on Asgard felt super weak up to the point where all the characters showed up. I just felt like dividing the movie into two halves was kind of pointless if one half has a really weak villain as the main character. This movie for a lot of people is a landmark for cinema, and I can totally see why. Wakanda as a country is depicted as on top of the world, which makes the black representation in this film have the power of royalty to the highest degree. And on top of that, all the characters are super funny and lovable. It took Marvel 10 freaking years to figure out how to make a good villain that doesn't appear in multiple movies. Killmonger has legitimate motivations that aren't driven solely by, I want to be king and have power. He has a genuinely good argument against T'Challa and is able to tie it back to real-world contemporary problems, which makes for a really compelling plot. Their duel for the throne was genuinely one of the most powerful one-on-one battles in the entire MCU, which makes it such a shame that the final battle of this movie was really freaking lame. All the emotional weight that the duel held is completely gone, and yeah, it just feels like a CGI mess. Sorry, I gotta be that guy. Side note, in my notes for this movie, I wrote down during the King duel, this is how we should elect our presidents. That doesn't really add much to the review, I just thought it was funny. This film alone is enough to solidify Chadwick as a legend. He absolutely nailed the role in this incredible film. You'd expect after two different adaptations of Spider-Man in the past decade that people would react kindly to a new take on Spider-Man, but to my shock, a lot of people despise this movie. Not me though, I found this to be a really cool way to bring Spider-Man into the MCU. Maybe Peter relied a little too much on Tony, but like that was kind of the point of the movie, because this movie is about Peter trying to prove that he is still worthy to be Spider-Man without the really fancy billion-dollar suit. I appreciate that they didn't rehash the same old stuff like Peter getting bitten and Uncle Ben dying, cause like unless you have a new and unique way to do it, what's the point of doing it again? In this movie, you get thrown straight into the action following Peter immediately after Civil War, which I feel further solidifies it within the MCU rather than trying so hard to make another template Spider-Man reboot. At the end of the movie, Tony offers Peter a place on the Avengers team, and he turns it down, which while this is a very mature thing to do and makes sense for Peter's arc, I just don't get why Tony offered it to him in the first place. I feel like even though he caught the Vulture, he still caused a lot of destruction in the process instead of just calling Tony or letting Tony deal with it. That's why he was mad at him when the boat split in half earlier in the movie. So I don't know, I feel like it could have been really easy for Tony to be pissed at him nonetheless. Also, it's inevitable that Peter will become an Avenger, so him turning it down in this movie is really mature, but just means that it's all gonna get thrown down the drain in Infinity War. So honestly, I don't really know how to feel about this ending. Either way, I'm so glad that Sony and Disney were able to come to some sort of an agreement for this trilogy, because finally we have a unique perspective on live-action Spider-Man. You know, I really don't understand why this movie gets hated so much. It has such a strong familial theme with a focus on transcending your blood family. And something that this movie does that the last one didn't do is that the soundtrack actually fits with thematic perfection to the plot of the movie. Brandy, You're a Fine Girl, Father and Son, heck, even My Sweet Lord all have lyrics that fit perfectly within the plot of the movie. Now, this was something I was able to figure out in theaters when I first saw this movie after having listened to the Awesome Mix songs quite a bit. And I gotta say, the part where Ego basically spoon feeds the lyrics of Brandy, You're a Fine Girl to the audience to help them understand the plot connections really didn't sit well with me. You see, Peter, we're the sailor in this song, and your mother, now she's Brandy. Do you understand the similarities I'm presenting to you, Peter? Anyways, the movie is yet again super action-packed and exciting. Both halves of the plot were always super interesting to see, whether it be Groot, Rocket, and Yondu trying to break out of Yondu's ship, or Peter, Gamora, and Ego hanging out on his planet. Nebula's murder attempt on Gamora was genuinely terrifying. It also was just so perfect to have for their relationship going forward in Infinity War and Endgame. And it all just adds up to this idea that even despite all the arguing and hatred all these characters have for each other, they're still a family and they will not hesitate to save each other when needed. You know what that's called? It's called really good character writing. This is why I love these movies. God, I can't wait for Guardians 3 later this year. Okay, moving on. Yeah, of course this is a great movie. I feel like no matter what was going to happen in this movie, as long as it had this scene, it was going to be great. But this movie takes it to the next level by finding such a great way to sum up all the characters retiring from the franchise while also just kind of summarizing the entire franchise up to this point. The Infinity Stone hunt provided the perfect plot in order to do that. We get to see where all the characters were in the past and where they are now. Thor finds some closure with his mom, Steve finds some closure with Peggy, and Tony finally gets some closure with his dad. I gotta say though, I feel like it'd be kind of hard to enjoy this movie a lot if you haven't watched the 21 movies before this. There's just so many little references and jokes that they bake into the plot really well, like when Cap tells S.H.I.E.L.D. members Hail Hydra, that make this movie feel so much more complete that you can't really get unless you watch all the other ones. That being said, the movie as a whole really did not have to be 3 hours long. I get that they needed to show where everyone was mentally after the snap, but I feel like the humor that they tried to throw in just didn't sit right considering the seriousness of what was going on. Thor screaming at Noobmaster69 on Fortnite was barely funny in 2019, and it's not much better now. Bruce Banner trying to get the kids to take a selfie with Ant-Man was just cringy, not funny. Rocket even tries to crack a joke about Captain Marvel within the first 10 minutes of this movie, and it really did not feel on tone with what was going on. A lot of the jokes in this movie remind me of the Who Talks First joke at the beginning of The Force Awakens. There's a time for comedic relief, but God, it does not have to be when the tone is the complete opposite of comedy. I don't know, I feel like a lot of little problems hold this movie back from being the incredible masterpiece that Infinity War is, but nonetheless, I still adore this movie. The theater experience of watching this scene will probably remain one of the greatest moments I've ever had at a movie theater in my entire life. You know, I've gone through enough of these movies to realize that Marvel really does not know how to make a good villain. They've got Loki, he's pretty cool and definitely has a defined personality. I mentioned earlier in this video that Killmonger is Marvel's only good example of a good standalone villain, and like, that's just about it. Up to this point in the MCU, there hadn't been many great villains. But then Marvel decided to make up for that by making Thanos not only one of the greatest characters in the MCU, but like in modern cinematic history in general. Thanos is a master manipulator. He used the Reality Stone on Nowhere to prove to Gamora that she cares at least a little bit for Thanos. He forced Peter to go through with attempting to kill Gamora. He even forced Wanda to try to kill Vision. And since he knew that none of these were going to have genuine effects on the world, he made them go through with the trauma of this for nothing. I'm not even exaggerating when I say I can't overstate how insane it is to watch this dude advocate for mass genocide, and then I somehow actually feel bad for him when he chooses to kill Gamora. His writing is spotless. He has genuinely good motivations, which is why it's easy to sympathize for him. He just has a really bad way of going about it. Seeing the full potential of the Infinity Stones in this movie leads to some mind-blowing scenes, like the one in Nowhere, the fight on Titan, and the scene right before Thanos takes the Mind Stone where he's just throwing people out of the way with little effort. I love how even though this movie is 2.5 hours long, it feels so incredibly short because every second is filled with action and is necessary for the movie. There's absolutely no filler here. And yeah, it is kind of significant to see the Avengers lose this badly when they've done nothing but win. I remember going into the theater to see this movie with really high expectations and still being taken aback at just how incredible this movie was. The whole movie, I was glued to the screen, from the compelling story, the exciting action, the heartbreaking moments, and the chilling realizations. I really hope one day that Marvel can build something up so well that it outperforms this movie. And if they're gonna do that, I really hope that they remember just how significant the emotions this movie had with every character were in making this film phenomenal. For me, it wasn't even the fact that everyone was in this movie that made it spectacular. It mostly had to do with just how well Thanos was able to emotionally scar all these characters that we know and love. This right here is the MCU's greatest achievement. Wow, that was a fun one. I hope you guys enjoyed my ranking of the greatest MCU phase. Next up, when I rank Phase 4, I'm gonna do a separate ranking for the movies and Disney Plus shows, but all in the same video. It'll be a really big video. So in the meantime, you should subscribe to my channel. Check out my other 2 Marvel rankings if you haven't already. Follow me on Twitch because my live streams are pretty fun, and with that, I'll see ya in Radiator Springs.